The man who wrote the code that 30% of the world's internet servers run as their operating system foundation, whose kernel contribution the JIT log documents as the 17,000 commits across 22 years of the project's existence, as the individual's measurable investment in the platform, whose technical superiority the honest comparison with every proprietary alternative confirms as the genuine architectural achievement, posted his resignation from the Linux kernel mailing list on a Friday morning with a single paragraph whose final sentence the community read and reread for 3 days as the statement whose implication the surface reading understated as the inadequate summary of what the departure actually signaled about the direction the Linux project is moving toward as the deliberate transformation rather than the accidental drift. He did not leave because of burnout. He did not leave because of a better opportunity. He left because the Linux he spent 22 years building, as the ideological commitment to the specific vision of what computing freedom meant as the technical and cultural principle, is becoming something he no longer recognizes as the project he joined, and the people making it unrecognizable are not the enemies from outside, but the architects from inside, whose decisions the community cannot reverse because the reversals would cost the corporate partnerships whose financial support the modern Linux project's survival requires, as the uncomfortable dependency the idealism must accommodate as the pragmatic reality. This is not the story about the open source project's normal evolution, whose discomfort the traditionalists' resistance to the inevitable progress produces as the generational friction every technology platform's maturation generates as the standard transition cost. This is the story about the specific, documented, and accelerating transformation whose direction the corporate influences systematic expansion, the governance structure's concentration, the contributor demographics narrowing, and the technical philosophy's commercial realignment together define as the coordinated change whose cumulative effect the Linux of 2026 represents as the qualitatively different entity from the Linux, whose founding vision the 1991 announcement described as the free operating system for the people who owned the machines it ran on. The change is real. The change is measurable. The change is happening faster than the community's public conversation acknowledges as the proportionate response. And not everyone is happy. A statement whose understatement, the resignation letters, the fork announcements, the mailing list arguments, and the community fractures together correct as the accurate characterization of a platform in the middle of the identity crisis, whose resolution will determine whether Linux becomes the enterprise infrastructure layer the corporations are funding it to become, or the computing freedom's technical expression the volunteers built it to be. The first dimension of the forever change, whose documentation this examination assembles as the evidence base, is the corporate contributor concentration, whose Linux kernel development statistics, the Linux Foundation's own annual report, reveals as the organizational distribution that the community-driven development narrative the project's public identity deploys cannot accurately describe as the complete picture of who is writing Linux and whose interests the writing serves as the primary motivation. The Linux kernel's contributor statistics, whose Linux Foundation annual report documents as the organizational breakdown, reveal that the top 10 corporate contributors, Intel, Red Hat, Google, Samsung, NVIDIA, Meta, Microsoft, Huawei, IBM, and Linaro, collectively author between 65 and 72% of the kernel commits in the measured development cycles, with the individual volunteer contributor, whose nights and weekends the founding mythology centers as the Linux development's romantic origin story contributing the remaining fraction, whose percentage the corporate concentration's growth has compressed from the majority position, the early kernel's development reflected as the volunteer dominant contribution environment into the minority, share the current statistics document as the structural reality of the modern Linux kernel's development ecosystem. The corporate contributor, whose employment the Intel salary or the Red Hat compensation funds as the full-time kernel development allocation, brings the engineering depth, the sustained commitment, and the hardware access that the volunteer contributor's part-time engagement cannot match as the equivalent development velocity. And the kernel improvement, the performance optimization, and the hardware support whose delivery this corporate investment enables is genuine and valuable and real. But the corporate contributor whose kernel submission the employer's product roadmap motivates as the primary driver introduces the feature, the driver, and the architectural decision whose alignment with the corporation's commercial interest, rather than the user's computing freedom, serves as the organizing priority. And the alignment between those two interests, the honest examination cannot assume as the guaranteed correspondence when the corporation's product strategy and the user's autonomy occupy the different positions in the value hierarchy, whose conflict the feature's design resolves in the corporation's favor as the funding relationship's natural consequence. The second dimension is the system integration's architectural depth, whose expansion from the init system's original scope into the network management, the DNS resolution, the bootloader, the home directory management, and the container orchestration layer together represent as the single project's scope expansion, that the Linux ecosystem's traditional Unix philosophy of the small tool doing the single task, well explicitly defined as the architectural anti-pattern, whose adoption the Linux system's design should resist as the philosophical commitment. System's architectural expansion, whose current scope, the component list, system denetworked, system deresolved, system deboot, system dehomed, system denspawned, system delogin, system journaled, and the 17 additional components whose integration in the modern Linux distribution's default configuration enables as the standard system layer, documents as the monolithic architecture whose single point of failure, whose debugging complexity, and whose architectural coupling the Unix philosophy's decomposed design explicitly avoided as the engineering principle, has become the Linux distribution's standard foundation, whose removal the package dependency graph's depth makes practically impossible as the real-world alternative on the distributions whose default adoption the major desktop Linux ecosystem has completed as the universal integration. The developer who disagrees with system's architectural philosophy, who prefers the RUnit, the S6, the OpenRC, or the init system as the technically superior alternative whose Unix philosophy alignment the genuine architectural argument supports, finds that the disagreement's practical expression requires the distribution selection from the narrowing list whose system-free maintenance the volunteer effort sustains against the upstream pressure, rather than the mainstream distribution's architectural decision. The package dependency's depth has effectively finalized as the irreversible default. The Linus Torvalds, whose public commentary on system the community parsed as the cautious skepticism rather than the enthusiastic endorsement, whose kernel's position as the layer beneath the init system theoretically separates as the independent architectural decision from the init system's selection, watches the ecosystem, whose kernel his contribution built adopt the architectural philosophy, whose Unix decomposition principle the system design explicitly departs from as the acknowledged trade-off whose benefits the Red Hat engineering team argues as the justification and whose costs the traditionalist community documents as the legitimate concern whose dismissal the adoption momentum achieves as the practical silencing rather than the technical resolution. The third dimension is the Rust language integration, whose Linux kernel adoption the memory safety argument motivates as the genuine security improvement, but whose implementation pace, whose C code displacement, and whose contributor barriers elevation together generate as the community fracture between the memory safety advocate and the experienced C developer whose 20-year kernel expertise the Rust requirements introduction renders as the suddenly insufficient qualification for the new subsystem's contribution. The kernel's Rust integration, whose announcement the security community welcomed as the memory safety improvement addressing the class of vulnerabilities, the buffer overflow, the use after free, the null pointer dereference, whose C language's manual memory management the exploit ecosystem targets as the reliable attack surface, represents the genuine technical advancement whose security benefit the honest assessment confirms as the valuable improvement whose implementation the kernel's code-based modernization requires as the long-term maintenance investment. The experienced kernel developer, whose C expertise the 20-year contribution history documents, as the deep technical mastery encounters the Rust subsystem's contribution requirement, as the language learning investment whose cost, the retirement age's proximity, the family responsibilities competing demand, or the expertise's existing depth makes as the unfavorable allocation of the finite learning capacity, and the contribution's barrier, whose elevation the Rust requirement achieves as the language proficiency's prerequisite removes the experienced C developer from the subsystem's contributor pool, not because the developer's kernel understanding is insufficient, but because the kernel's language is changing faster than the developer's available investment in the language transition can accommodate as the practical constraint. The contributor demographic, whose Rust integration shifts toward the younger developer, whose university curriculum, the Rust language's recent prominence, has incorporated as the standard teaching material, and away from the experienced C developer, whose historical contribution the kernel's current codebase reflects as the accumulated expertise, produces the knowledge transfer risk whose documentation the retiring C maintainer's institutional knowledge represents, as the undocumented system understanding that the Rust contributor's technical proficiency cannot substitute as the equivalent replacement when the understanding lives in the developer rather than the documentation whose completeness the kernel's comment coverage does not achieve as the reliable knowledge preservation. The fourth dimension is the Code of Conduct's implementation, whose Linux kernel adoption the 2018 introduction initiated as the community standard governing the contributor interaction, and whose enforcement's subsequent history the mailing list moderation decisions, the contributor removal actions, and the community behavior standards application together document as the ongoing source of the ideological conflict between the meritocratic culture, the kernel development tradition established as the quality standard in the inclusive culture. The conduct framework prioritizes as the community health requirement whose tension the simultaneous pursuit creates as the unresolved contradiction. Linus Torvalds, whose public communication style the mailing list archive documents as the technically precise but interpersonally harsh feedback delivery that the kernel contributor's incorrect submission received as the correction mechanism. The famous responses whose directness the recipient experienced as the humiliation, but whose technical accuracy, the kernel quality the standard maintained, stepped back from the kernel's development in 2018, with the public acknowledgement that the behavior whose correction the Code of Conduct's adoption signaled required the personal reflection, whose outcome the communication style's moderation represented as the commitment to the different engagement standard. The step back in the return whose subsequent communication style the mailing list's honest comparison with the pre-2018 record reveals as the measurable moderation documented as the conduct framework's practical impact on the project's leadership behavior. But the conduct framework whose application the kernel maintainer community extends beyond the communication style's moderation into the contributions evaluation, the maintainer's behavior standard, and the community participation's cultural expectation generates the recurring controversy whose mailing list manifestation, the argument between the technical excellence's primacy and the community inclusion's priority, produces as the unresolved fundamental disagreement about whether the Linux kernel is the technical project whose quality standard justifies the harsh feedback culture, or the community project whose human participation requires the welcoming environment as the contributor retention's prerequisite. The fifth dimension is the distribution consolidation whose market dynamic the enterprise Linux landscape's evolution produces as the Fedora, the Ubuntu, the RHEL, and the Debian together capture the installation-based percentage whose combined magnitude the long-tail distribution's survival increasingly challenges as the sustainable development model, when the corporate backing's absence the resource competition with the well-funded major distribution creates as the maintenance capacity's structural disadvantage. The Linux distribution ecosystem whose historical abundance, the DistroWatch's active distribution count whose measurement the hundreds designation approximates as the rough magnitude, represented the choice freedom the Linux philosophy's expression celebrated as the practical demonstration of the open source model's permissionless innovation, is undergoing the consolidation whose mechanism is not the hostile acquisition, but the resource attrition whose operation the volunteer maintainer's burnout, the corporate distribution's feature, Velocity's competitive advantage, and the Flatpak universality's distribution-agnostic delivery together execute as the combined pressure whose sustained application the independent distribution's development bandwidth cannot absorb as the permanent capacity. The distribution whose single maintainer, the us retirement, the health event, or the employment change removes as the project's continuing resource announces the end of life, whose user base the migration recommendation directs toward the major distribution as the supported alternative. And each migration's completion, the consolidation's advancement represents as the ecosystem's diversity reduction, whose cumulative effect the active distribution counts multi-year decline documents as the measurable trend. The Ubuntu's snap package mandate, the Fedora's bleeding edge update philosophy, and the RHEL's enterprise stability requirement together represent three corporate visions of what Linux should be as the product whose design the corporate strategy, rather than the community consensus, determines as the primary input, and the independent distribution whose community governance the volunteer consensus produces as the decision mechanism finds the upstream's corporate. Direction's influence increasingly difficult to resist as the dependency relationship's practical constraint. When the kernel, the desktop environment, the init system, and the application distribution layer, whose corporate contributor concentration the upstream development reflects, as the organizational reality defines the components, the independent distribution assembles as the downstream integration. The sixth dimension is the hardware manufacturer's Linux certification, whose expansion, the Steam Deck's commercial success, the enterprise laptop vendor's Linux offering, and the cloud infrastructure's Linux dominance together motivate as the market validation, but whose certification requirements implementation. The proprietary firmware, the binary blob driver, and the signed kernel module together introduce as the open source principles compromise that the hardware support's practical benefit requires as the unavoidable trade-off. The NVIDIA driver, whose Linux support the proprietary binary blob provided, as the performance-capable but source-unavailable implementation that the open-source purist's rejection and the gamer's pragmatic acceptance created as the community's philosophical division, represents the hardware integration template, whose expansion the firmware-dependent Wi-Fi card, the Bluetooth chipset's binary firmware, and the laptop's embedded controller's proprietary interface together replicate as the increasing proportion of the functional Linux system's component stack, whose operation in the open source code does not fully control as the transparent implementation. The Linux that runs on the hardware the user purchased today is increasingly the Linux whose functionality the proprietary firmware enables as the practical requirement, whose open source alternative the hardware vendor's binary only release policy prevents as the unavailable option, and the hardware supports improvement that the certification's expansion delivers as the user experience's genuine advancement comes packaged with the open source philosophy's incremental compromise that the pragmatist accepts as the reasonable trade-off, and the purist documents as the principle's erosion whose acceleration the hardware dependency's growth represents as the directional signal. Linux is changing forever, because the corporate contributor's 65% kernel authorship transforms the community project into the enterprise infrastructure whose development priority the commercial roadmap increasingly determines as the primary input, rather than the user's computing freedom as the original organizing principle. Because the system's architectural expansion from the init system into the system management monolith replaces the Unix philosophy's decomposed design with the integrated architecture, whose single-point concentration the traditional developer's objection documents as the engineering regression, whose adoption momentum the dependency graph makes irreversible as the practical reality. Because the Rust integration's language barrier elevates the contribution requirement beyond the experienced C developer's existing expertise, redistributing the contributor demographic toward the newer developer, whose language currency the university curriculum reflects, and away from the institutional knowledge the 20-year contributor's accumulated understanding represents as the undocumented system intelligence. Because the Code of Conduct's cultural framework introduces the unresolved tension between the technical excellence's harsh feedback tradition and the inclusive community's welcoming environment requirement, whose simultaneous satisfaction the implementation cannot achieve as the compatible pursuit when the underlying values the conflict reveals occupy the different positions in the priority hierarchy. Because the distribution consolidation's resource attrition reduces the ecosystem's diversity from the hundreds of the independent community visions into the handful of the corporate-backed mainstream distributions whose strategic alignment with the enterprise market. The independent distribution's community governance cannot replicate as the equivalent competitive position. Because the hardware certification's proprietary firmware dependency trades the open source philosophy's source transparency for the hardware functionality's practical delivery, whose user experience improvement. The compromise's cost, the pragmatist accepts, and the purist refuses as the incompatible value exchange. Linux is changing forever, and not everyone is happy. The contributor who built it as the freedom is watching it become the infrastructure. The volunteer who maintained it as the community is watching it become the product. The idealist who chose it as the principle is watching it become the platform. The developer who loved it as the philosophy is quietly reinstalling the alternative on a Tuesday afternoon and writing the private message whose honest explanation arrives 3 weeks later as the answer the community asked for, but whose reception the community's comfort with the change the community is pretending is not happening cannot accommodate as the welcome perspective. The change is real. The unhappiness is real. And the forever that Linux is changing into is the forever the corporations are funding, the forever the enterprise is requiring, and the forever the pragmatist is accepting. Not the forever the person who wrote the first line of the kernel in 1991, described as the vision whose realization the project's direction was supposed to represent as the destination. The destination changed. The journey continues. And the question whose answer the next decade's Linux will provide as the lived evidence is whether the platform that changed computing forever can survive becoming the thing that computing's commercial infrastructure requires it to be without losing the thing that made the people who built it believe it was worth building in the first place. That question is the one nobody is talking about. Until now.